Hello, my name is Will, and I have in the past posted videos about 40K, the lore, the books. I have a Black Library book club on Twitter that I post literary criticism of Black Library novels, as silly as that might sound. I have in the past collaborated with other 40K content producers on YouTube to try and discuss like the background and history of 40K, the lore. I've tried talking about the books in, kind of a more critical review on Twitter. I'm trying something new in that I wanted to talk about themes. I wanted to talk about these books not just as specifically like what happens novel to novel or you know um, the backstory of 40K or anything like that, but just why are these books worth reading and why some of them aren't. Um, Basically, just to start off, we need to talk about licensed fiction. Basically, any series of novels that's based on an existing IP, from comics to tabletop RPGs to whatever. There's always a price of entry. You need to be familiar with the setting, the main characters to some extent, things like that to really know what's going on in the book and be able to do it. Most of these kinds of books aren't great. I've read quite a few of them, and Black Library included. It's a struggle to read a novel where you're expected to know something that might be in a splash book, which is a kind of narrative background book for the game, or some other source material that you're just not going to have access to. Another thing that you would be turned off by is if there's weird, writing that throws you off. One thing I think about particularly are the first Dragonlance novels, the Chronicles series, where they refer to a group of characters as Elven Rangers with, no description of what that is. You just have to know Rangers of Dungeons and Dragons class. You should know what this means. So, that being said, licensed fiction is a bit of a mixed bag, mostly bad when you get into it. But with 40K, it's come a long way since the first books came out. In 1994, they got this guy named Ian Watson. He wrote the Inquisition War trilogy. He was like a co-screenwriter on the AI movie with Spielberg and Kubrick, and he wrote these just insane, ridiculous novels that are completely not canon today. A Squat, which is a space dwarf's main character. A lot of things that weren't fleshed out until much later are present, and they're just they're crazy books to read. I kind of recommend them just because I think the atmosphere is really cool. But from then to now, where the Horus Heresy series has been completed, right now they're writing the Battle of Terra novels to kind of cap out that part of the history of the setting. The books have come a long way since then, and the writing has improved. They've hired a lot of really talented writers to write books that you can take a little bit more seriously, and the price of entry isn't as high as it used to be. Basically, what I want to talk about in this video is how to tell what's worth it and what's not, and you'll know that by what books have really strong thematic, through lines and which ones don't. The two books, the books I want to use as kind of baseline comparisons here are The Night Lord's Omnibus by Aaron Dembski-Bowden and Wrath of Iron by Chris Wray. These books, without getting into the particulars of them, have a similar thematic approach in that, the whole kind of concept of adventure, heroism, the kind of things that you expect from a genre story have had all color, had all, appeal, allure stripped away from them by, time, bureaucracy, and just, systemic, failure. This is a similar theme to things you see in Venture Brothers or the most recent adaptation of The Tick on Amazon Prime, where essentially the future has sort of failed us, and the idea is that, we have, corporatized to an extent these things that, should be more exciting and dramatic. You get a real strong sense of ennui, from the protagonist, the main characters, just lamenting the idea that they're still doing what they're doing, that they're, having to pursue these objectives when they know in the grand scheme of things it's kind of irrelevant. This sounds super depressing, and that's what it is. 40K is essentially a very depressing and huge bummer of a setting. You shouldn't. I feel like the books where it's Space Marines come in, they save the day, they fight things and defeat the bad guys. While there are books that do this that aren't bad per se, they're not interesting. They're not worthy of more serious analysis, I guess is what I'm looking for here. Specifically I think the big thing you need to look for, at least what I'm going to talk about in this video, are how Space Marines are portrayed. So just to give you a quick, little primer here, Space Marines are post-humans. They are made by taking children anywhere from 5 to 15 years old. They are implanted with all these genetic enhancements, with cybernetic enhancements. They are hypnotically indoctrinated into, the Imperial cult, the chapter practices, things like that. They're basically, children that are biologically sped up into adults. And, in a lot of 40K books, they act like adults. You'll see these characters interact with people like, an adult would. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. Children are emotionally and mentally underdeveloped. Now, the mental part, at least as far as, knowledge of how to shoot a gun or fly a ship, things like that gets addressed through the indoctrination processes of becoming a Space Marine. But, the emotional aspect of it remains. A child doesn't really have a good grasp of complex emotional connections. And when you skip that process, it creates this weird, almost non-human sense of lack of empathy, lack of sympathy. And there are books that explore that well, as the aforementioned Night Lords, Wrath of Iron. I also want to mention Hell's Reach by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, where the Space Marines genuinely do not understand human behavior. It baffles them. And in turn, humans are put off or unnerved by Space Marines. They're supposed to be kind of human, but interacting with them, you're like, this is super uncomfortable. I don't know how I feel about this. These themes, and when they're explored properly, are kind of a good way to tell early on, is this something I want to keep reading? Is this really going to be interesting to me? Whenever there's a good exploration of this dynamic, between Space Marines and, humans, and why these two groups exist, how they interact with each other, that's I think the basis for a solid, at least a 40K book involving Space Marines. If I keep doing these videos, which I don't know, I just decided to do this at a whim after I finished working, late into the morning. We'll talk about some of the other cool things that, you could use to determine, is this something I'd be into? Is this something worth approaching? And maybe also talk about some of the more problematic aspects of the 40K setting and why I think the brand has continued to struggle when, you see like tabletop RPG games and other kind of cornerstones of the gaming culture becoming more broadly accepted and a little bit more widespread, why GW has continued to struggle breaking out and kind of is like this last bastion of like traditional gaming gatekeeping. So if you like this video, like it, comment, see what you think about it. I have no professional equipment to do anything like this. I'm doing this on my phone in my office, and that's probably how I'm going to keep doing it. I don't, foresee this being a huge, like super big investment on my part. I just wanted to try it out and see how it went. I do recommend, if you're under 40K, checking out those books I just mentioned. I do want to recommend, you can check out my book club. It's, I think, Black Library BO1 on Twitter. And I also recommend Neoscum, the podcast, which is amazing. It has nothing to do with 40K. It's a Shadowrun Actual Play podcast, but you should still check it out. Anyway, let me know what you think of this, and I might do another one.